John stood on the edge of the room, blending into the shadows, his breath shallow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before him, Matt's fingers tracing delicate patterns across Emily's skin, movements filled with a tenderness John hadn't felt in years. The closeness between them was undeniable, and when Matt whispered something inaudible into her ear, Emily smiled, a smile that seemed so effortless, so genuine, as if she was exactly where she belonged. Matt's lips brushed her neck, and she responded by leaning into him, her entire body melting into the moment, as though everything else ceased to exist. Watching this, John felt a surge of emotion rise within him, a storm brewing under the surface. At first, it was anger, raw and consuming. This was his wife, his friend, and together they had crossed a line he never thought possible. His fists clenched involuntarily, and the urge to charge in, to confront them both, to tear apart their illusion, grew stronger with every passing second. He could feel his pulse in his throat, each heartbeat louder than the last, convinced that any moment now, they would hear him. His mind screamed for action, for justice, but his body refused to move. He remained frozen in place, watching, waiting. Then, something unexpected began to shift inside him. The fury that had gripped him so tightly started to lose its hold, giving way to an emotion far more complex. As his eyes followed their movements, Matt's hands, Emily's responses, he felt an odd, unsettling sensation. A strange pleasure, one he couldn't quite name, began to surface. He should have been in agony, drowning in betrayal, but instead, there was something else, a pull, a captivation, as if the very scene he dreaded was now holding him in its thrall. With each soft touch, each whispered word, his anger slowly faded, replaced by a fascination that defied explanation. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, something deep within him stirring in response to what he saw. John's thoughts spiraled. How could he feel this way? How could something so wrong fill him with such intensity? Torn between the moral outrage he knew he should feel and the strange allure that kept him rooted to the spot, he stood there, motionless. Inside, a battle raged between his understanding of what was right and the undeniable pull of his own desires, desires he had never known existed. That moment was the beginning of everything. The moment when the lines between love, betrayal, and desire blurred beyond recognition. What started as anger transformed into something darker, deeper, and far more complex. And instead of running, instead of ending it all, John chose to stay, to watch, to let the story unfold in a way he could never have imagined. Sitting on the back porch, John nursed a beer, the warmth of the evening sun brushing against his skin as it set behind the hills. His kids' laughter echoed across the lawn, a comforting sound in the midst of his turmoil. It should have been a perfect evening. The scent of barbecue from nearby homes, the steady hum of sprinklers, the light breeze. This was the dream, wasn't it? A family, a home, the kind of life anyone would envy. Yet, beneath the surface, something was wrong. John stood on the edge of the room, blending into the shadows, his breath shallow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before him. Matt's fingers tracing delicate patterns across it wasn't anything obvious, at least not at first. There were no screaming matches, no dramatic confrontations, just a slow, creeping distance. Emily seemed different, distracted, always glued to her phone, notifications flashing more frequently than before, always when she thought he wasn't paying attention. They used to talk after the kids went to bed, sharing their day, savoring the quiet moments together. But now, those moments were rare, nearly gone. Emily would retreat early, offering excuses about being tired, disappearing into their bedroom with her phone in hand, leaving John to wonder when everything had changed. He kept telling himself it was nothing. People change with time. Marriage settles into routine, right? That's what everyone said. Friends, family. After years together, couples start to take things for granted. It's normal, they said. But even as John repeated those words in his mind, a creeping unease gnawed at him. Every time Emily's laughter sounded a little too forced, every time her smile seemed too perfect, the knot in his stomach tightened. A quiet voice, buried deep, whispered that something wasn't right. And it wasn't just Emily. Matt, his best friend, had been around a lot more recently. Matt had always been part of their lives, almost like family, showing up at every barbecue, every game night, every casual evening after the kids went to bed. He and John had been inseparable since college, their friendship unshakable through all life's ups and downs. But lately, John noticed something different. Small things too subtle to confront, but too obvious to ignore. The way Emily and Matt exchanged looks, as if sharing some unspoken secret. The way their smiles lingered just a little too long. It's nothing, he told himself again and again. They've always been close. It's normal for friends to be comfortable like that, isn't it? But once doubt seeped in, it started to spread, slowly, quietly, until it was all he could think about. One night, after Emily had gone to bed, John sat alone in the living room. The flicker of the television cast shifting shadows across the walls, though he wasn't really watching. His mind wandered, retracing the same thoughts over and over. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. He reached for it automatically, but his attention shifted to Emily's phone, left charging on the table across the room. It buzzed again. John froze, his heart pounding louder with each passing second. He wasn't the type to check her phone, he never had been. But tonight, something felt different. The buzzing phone cut through the silence of the house, making his stomach twist with an unfamiliar dread. He stared at it for what felt like an eternity, every nerve in his body on edge. His heart hammered in his chest, urging him to leave it alone. Yet, his hands moved on their own, almost as if guided by something beyond his control. Before he knew it, he had Emily's phone in his hand. The screen lit up, and there it was, a message from Matt. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." John's breath caught in his throat. His eyes locked on the message, his mind struggling to process the words. He read it once, twice, over and over, hoping that maybe he had misunderstood. But there it was, clear and undeniable. A whirlwind of thoughts exploded in his mind. Fury surged through him, hot and blinding. He should storm into the bedroom, confront Emily, demand answers. His hands shook, muscles tense, ready to act. But instead of charging upstairs, John remained rooted to the spot. The anger he expected, the outrage he should have felt, it was there, but it didn't control him. Not this time. Something else, something darker, took hold of him. Curiosity. It clawed at his mind, demanding answers, but in a way he had never imagined. What had really been happening between them? How long had it been going on? He needed to know, but the questions swirled in his head like a storm, and instead of confronting the situation head-on, he did nothing. He just stood there, staring at the phone, consumed by a sickening mix of confusion and intrigue. That night, John didn't go to Emily. He didn't confront her. He didn't demand an explanation. He simply waited. The next few days passed in a fog. The message from Matt echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the secret he now carried. Yet, despite the weight of what he had discovered, he couldn't bring himself to act. His every instinct told him to confront her, to end it all, but something else held him back. Instead, he began to watch, to observe every interaction, every glance, every movement with a careful eye, as though the answers might reveal themselves if he looked closely enough. Quietly, without uttering a single word, John became an observer in his own life, studying Emily with a level of attention he had never given before. Her movements seemed different now, deliberate, cautious. He noticed how she glanced at her phone more often, her lips curling into a faint smile at messages she would quickly hide. She'd mention plans with friends or work, but when pressed for details, she always seemed vague, distant. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to John, each moment felt like a clue in an unraveling mystery. It was as if a fog had lifted from his eyes. The world he thought he knew, the life he had built with Emily, was now exposed under a different light. Every look she exchanged with Matt at their usual get-togethers carried a weight he hadn't seen before. Each time they shared a private laugh, touched hands for just a moment too long, or exchanged knowing smiles, it felt like they were communicating in a language only they understood. And the most disturbing part? John didn't feel the fury he expected. Instead, something darker stirred within him, a sick fascination, growing stronger by the day. He should be furious. Any normal husband would be. He should be making plans, thinking about what came next, maybe confronting them, maybe even ending it all. But the anger, the instinct for justice, wasn't there. Instead, John found himself sinking deeper into this twisted game, drawn in by an urge to know more, to see more. One evening, as Emily was showering, the temptation became too much. John reached for her phone again, unlocking it with the same ease as before. This time, his hands were steady, his pulse calm, as if the act had already become a part of his routine. He scrolled through her messages, his breath catching in his throat. There they were, conversations with Matt, full of teasing jokes and subtle flirtations. Some messages could be dismissed as harmless, but others hinted at something far more intimate. Inside jokes and then proof. A message from Matt, sent just a few days earlier. "I had a great time the other night. We should do it again soon." John felt his stomach twist into a knot, but the rage he expected didn't come. Instead, there was clarity, a cold, sharp understanding that this was the truth he had been avoiding. He had known deep down for some time now. He just hadn't been ready to see it. Now, there was no denying it. The betrayal was laid bare in front of him. Yet, as he stared at the screen, a whirlwind of emotions tore through him. Why wasn't he furious? Why wasn't he reacting like any other man in his situation? The realization hit him slowly, creeping into his mind like a shadow. He didn't want to confront Emily. He didn't want the shouting, the tears, the accusations that would follow. What he wanted was to see more, to understand it fully. He wanted to witness their secret moments, to know the depths of their betrayal, not out of pain, but out of a morbid curiosity. A part of him longed to stand on the outside, watching it unfold, knowing that they thought they were hiding. And that thought, that forbidden glimpse into their hidden world, brought an unexpected thrill that made his heart race. As the water stopped running in the bathroom and the sound of Emily's footsteps approached, John put her phone back in its place. He had made a decision. He wasn't going to confront them, not yet. He wanted to see where this would go. The following week passed in a strange haze, every moment filled with tension and anticipation. John observed Emily more closely than ever, pretending not to notice when she made up flimsy excuses to leave the house. An errand here, a quick meeting with a friend there. He played along, smiling, nodding, acting as if everything was fine. But underneath the facade, his curiosity burned hotter with each passing day. He had to know what she was doing when she wasn't with him. He needed to know. It didn't take long for John to piece it together. Emily and Matt weren't being as careful as they thought, and John's instincts had always been sharp. He watched, waited, and when the time was right, he followed. One Saturday afternoon, when Emily mentioned she'd be out running errands, John waited until she left, then quietly slipped out behind her. His heart thudded in his chest as he drove a few cars back, the thrill of the chase mingling with the pit of dread that had settled in his stomach. He knew where she was going before she even pulled into the parking lot. A small, secluded hotel on the outskirts of town. The truth, once a distant whisper, was now undeniable, staring him in the face. And yet, instead of breaking him, it pulled him in deeper. There was no mistaking it now. This was where it all happened. John parked a safe distance away, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He watched Emily step out of the car, her eyes darting around nervously before she walked inside. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow, as he waited. Moments later, Matt's car pulled up, and John's best friend casually strolled into the same hotel, unaware of the eyes watching him from a distance. For a brief moment, John considered rushing in, confronting them both, exposing their secret, shattering everything. But the thought passed as quickly as it came. Instead, he remained in the car, his pulse racing, his mind spinning with a mix of dread and anticipation. He couldn't tear his eyes away. That night, as John left the hotel, he felt something shift inside him. He had crossed a line he knew he could never come back from. Yet, The guilt he expected to feel never arrived. Instead, a strange sense of liberation washed over him. As if by watching them, he had discovered something new about himself, something he hadn't known was there. The drive home was silent, the events of the night replaying in his mind like scenes from a movie. Emily and Matt had no idea he had been there, just a few feet away, observing their every move. And that secret knowledge gave John a power he had never felt before. The days that followed were surreal. On the surface, everything was the same. Emily smiled at him across the dinner table, kissed him on the cheek before bed, played with the kids like nothing had changed. But for John, everything had changed. Every word she spoke, every glance she gave him, was now laced with a hidden meaning he couldn't ignore. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was the woman he was watching, the woman whose secrets he held in his hands. And that secret thrilled him. John's curiosity began to grow into something darker. It wasn't just about catching them in the act anymore. It was about feeding this twisted need that had taken root inside him. He started setting up more cameras, hiding them in places where he could watch without being seen. He became obsessed with their meetings, waiting eagerly for the next time Emily would make an excuse to leave the house. Each time she texted Matt, each time they made plans to meet, John was there, lurking in the shadows, watching their every move. But as the days passed, John noticed something else. Something within him was changing. The anger that had once burned inside him had dulled into a quieter, more complicated emotion. He should have felt betrayed, devastated, furious. But instead, he felt something closer to curiosity. A morbid curiosity that grew stronger with each passing day. And with that curiosity came a strange, unsettling acceptance. He didn't want to stop them. He didn't want to break apart what they had. He wanted to be a part of it. The thought hit him late one night, as he sat alone in the dark, watching the latest footage from the hidden cameras. Emily was getting ready to meet Matt again, her movements casual and unaware that John was watching her every move. And as he watched, the realization struck him. He didn't just want to observe them. He wanted to be involved. The idea terrified him at first. How could he want something so twisted, so wrong? But he had already crossed so many lines. What was one more? It felt like the next logical step in this dark, twisted journey. Over the next few days, John's mind spun with possibilities. How would he bring it up? How would Emily react? Would Matt even be open to the idea? The very thought of confronting them with his proposal both terrified and excited him. But one thing was clear. There was no going back to the way things were. He had changed, and now he wanted more. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. One evening, after the kids were in bed, John and Emily sat on the couch, the room filled with the soft hum of the TV in the background. Emily was scrolling through her phone, her eyes flicking to him occasionally, as if to check whether he was paying attention. "You've been spending a lot of time with Matt lately," John said, his tone casual, his gaze fixed on the TV. He felt her stiffen beside him, her fingers pausing mid-swipe on her phone. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice careful, trying to sound neutral. John turned to her, his expression calm, almost amused. "You don't have to lie, Emily. I know about you and Matt." The silence that followed was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Emily's face paled, her eyes wide with shock, her lips parting as if to say something, but no words came out. The truth hung between them, undeniable, and John felt a strange satisfaction settle over him. He wasn't angry, he wasn't hurt, he was intrigued, and now the game had truly begun. "David, she stammered, but he raised a hand to stop her. "I'm not angry," he said softly, the words almost surprising him as they left his mouth. "In fact, I've known for some time, and I've been watching." Sarah's breath hitched, her eyes wide as she stared at him, unsure of how to respond. "Watching?" she echoed, her voice barely audible. "I've seen everything," David continued, his voice calm, almost comforting. "I know what you've been doing with Mark, and, to be honest, I don't mind. In fact, I think I might want to be part of it." The room seemed to freeze. The weight of his words hung between them like a heavy fog. Sarah blinked, her mouth opening as if to respond, but no words came out. David felt a wave of relief wash over him, as if a burden he had carried for months had finally been lifted. He had said it. There was no turning back now. "David, what are you saying?" Sarah finally managed, her voice shaking. David smiled softly, reaching for her hand. "I've been watching you two for a while now, and I want to join you." Sarah stared at him, her face a mix of confusion, fear, and something else David couldn't quite decipher. The silence between them grew heavy, almost suffocating. Slowly, she pulled her hand away, her fingers trembling. "You want to join us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. David nodded, his heart pounding in his chest, though his outward calm remained steady. "Yes," he said quietly, the word hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. "I've been watching for a while, and I don't feel the way I thought I would. I don't feel angry or betrayed. I feel curious. I feel like there's more to this than just an affair, and I want to explore it. With you. And Mark." Sarah's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, David thought she might run, might break down or lash out. But instead, she sat still, her face unreadable. Slowly, she turned away, biting her lip as though weighing the enormity of his words. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, the air thick with uncertainty. This was the moment everything could fall apart, or perhaps something new could begin. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah finally spoke. "I don't know what to say." Her voice was small, fragile. She looked at David, searching his face for some reassurance. "How long have you known?" David exhaled, feeling the truth pour out like a long-held secret. "A few months," he admitted. "I followed you once to the hotel, and then I started watching, setting up cameras. I know it sounds insane, but once I started, I couldn't stop. I had to know everything." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with shock and disbelief. "You set up cameras?" she gasped, shaking her head, struggling to comprehend what he was saying. "You've been spying on me?" David leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "I didn't do it to hurt you. I just needed to understand. I needed to know what was happening between you and Mark, and the more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't about you betraying me. It was about something else, something I can't explain, but something I need to explore." Sarah leaned back, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "I don't know if Mark would," she began, but David interrupted her. "I'll talk to Mark," he said confidently, as though that were the simplest part of all this. "But first, I need to know where you stand. Are you open to this, to all of us together?" Sarah's breath caught again, her gaze locking with his. "David, this is crazy," she said, shaking her head. "I don't even know what to think." He reached for her hand again, this time with more conviction. "I know it sounds crazy, but I've seen how you look at him, how the two of you are together, and I'm not angry anymore. I'm curious. I want to understand. I want to be part of it, and I think maybe you do too." Sarah's expression softened, her fingers gently tightening around his. For the first time since this conversation began, David saw the tension in her face ease, replaced by something almost like relief. She glanced down at their joined hands, then back at him, her lips parting slightly. "You really want this?" David nodded, his voice firm. "I do. I want to try it." Sarah closed her eyes for a brief moment, taking a deep breath before exhaling slowly. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady, her decision made. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's talk to Mark." The days that followed felt surreal to David. He had anticipated fear, guilt, or even shame to settle in as the reality of his proposal took shape. But instead, what he felt was something entirely different. A sense of liberation, of excitement. This was new territory, something far beyond anything he had ever envisioned, and the idea of it filled him with an electric thrill. When he finally met with Mark, the conversation unfolded almost too smoothly. They met at their usual bar, and after a few drinks, David cautiously brought up the topic. Mark's initial reaction was one of shock, followed by a long, tense silence. But as David continued, explaining the months of observation, of watching, and ultimately, his desire to join them, something in Mark's expression shifted. "Are you serious?" Mark asked, his voice low, disbelief laced through his words. David nodded. "I've never been more serious. I'm not here to break this up, Mark. I just want to understand it, to be part of it, if you're open to that." Mark took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving David's. The silence between them grew heavy, the tension palpable. Finally, Mark set his glass down, leaned back in his chair, and let out a long breath. "All right," he said, his voice calm. "If this is really what you want, I'm in." And just like that, the door had been opened. The night they all came together for the first time was unlike anything David had imagined. The air in the room was thick with tension, almost suffocating, as they sat in the living room. Each of them was keenly aware of the line they were about to cross. Sarah sat next to David, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of hair, while Mark sat across from them, his face unreadable. For a while, no one spoke, the silence hanging over them like a heavy weight. David's heart pounded, a mix of excitement and uncertainty swirling within him. He had pushed them to this moment, but now that it was here, doubts flickered in his mind. Would this destroy everything? Would he regret it the moment they crossed that line? Or would it unlock something new? Something he hadn't realized he was searching for? Sarah was the first to break the silence. "So what now?" Her voice was soft, hesitant, as she looked between David and Mark. The unspoken question hung in the air. "How do we start?" David glanced at her, then at Mark, his mind racing to find the right words. He had been the one to bring them to this point, the one who had urged them into this unknown space. Now it was up to him to guide them forward. "We take it slow," David said quietly, his voice calm despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "We don't have to rush. We just see how it feels." Mark leaned back, a faint smile touching his lips. "You really want this, David?" His tone wasn't mocking, but there was a lingering disbelief, as if he still couldn't fully comprehend that David was sitting there, asking for this. David nodded. "I do." And it was true. As strange as it felt, as out of place as the situation seemed, deep down, David knew that this was what he wanted. The curiosity that had consumed him for months, the dark pull that had driven him to observe, to follow, to obsess, all led to this moment. And now he was ready. The first touch was tentative. Sarah reached out, her hand brushing against David's knee, as if testing the boundaries. David felt a shiver run through him, not out of fear, but from something deeper, something raw and unfiltered. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the years of familiarity, the comfort of their marriage, seemed to dissolve, replaced by something new, something dangerous. Mark watched them closely, his gaze steady, waiting for a silent cue to join. David nodded, and with that, Mark leaned forward, his hand resting gently on Sarah's other leg. The energy in the room shifted, the air heavy with a new intensity that David had never felt before. It was as though they were stepping off the edge into the unknown, and there was no turning back. What followed was a blur of sensations, emotions tangled in ways David couldn't fully comprehend. He watched as Sarah responded to Mark's touch, her body reacting in ways he hadn't seen in years. Yet instead of jealousy or anger, David felt something entirely different, a profound sense of liberation. By relinquishing control, he had gained something deeper, something unspoken. He wasn't just watching anymore, he was part of it. Every movement, every whisper, every glance exchanged felt like a choreographed dance, one they had unknowingly been rehearsing for months. As the night unfolded, the lines between them blurred, until there was no longer a distinction between husband, wife, and friend. They were all simply together. When it ended, the room was quiet once again, the intensity slowly fading like a receding tide. Sarah lay between them, her breathing soft and even, her face serene in a way David hadn't seen in a long time. Mark sat on the edge of the couch, his expression thoughtful, yet calm. David stared up at the ceiling, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't yet untangle. What had just happened? And more importantly, what did it mean for the three of them going forward? He didn't feel regret. That was what surprised him most. He had expected guilt, a wave of shame. But instead, there was only a sense of peace, of contentment. They had crossed a line, but instead of breaking them, it had brought them closer. In the days that followed, what had happened that night wasn't just a one-off occurrence. It became part of their lives, an unspoken agreement that settled between them. Mark continued to visit, but the dynamic had shifted. There was no longer any need for secrecy or sneaking around. For David, that was the most liberating part. He no longer had to watch from the sidelines, no longer had to wonder what was happening when he wasn't around. He was fully immersed in it. The jealousy he had feared never materialized. Instead, he found himself drawn deeper into this new reality, where the lines between love, desire, and possession were constantly shifting and evolving. But as the days passed, David couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The man he had been before, the steady husband, the father who took pride in control and predictability, felt distant now, like a figure from another life. He had stepped into a world where boundaries no longer existed, where the rules of marriage and relationships didn't apply in the same way anymore. That thought excited him, but it also left him with a lingering question. Who was he becoming? The curiosity that had first led him to watch had transformed into something far more complex, something he couldn't fully understand. David had embraced this new version of himself, but deep down, he couldn't help but wonder how far it would go, and what it would cost him in the end. His life had shifted in ways he could never have imagined. The nights with Sarah and Mark became part of their routine, slipping into their lives as easily as everything else. What once felt like a forbidden thrill now seemed almost normal. The boundaries that once defined his marriage and sense of self had completely eroded. Yet, with each passing night, the satisfaction that David once found in watching, in participating, began to fade. The excitement that had driven him was now replaced with something else, a hollowness that gnawed at him, leaving him restless. The quiet moments after their nights together, the stillness, were filled with an emptiness he couldn't quite name. He thought back to the beginning. Back then, the thrill of voyeurism, the excitement of discovery, had consumed him. But now, as he lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling while Sarah slept peacefully beside him, the thrill was gone. All that remained was a void. The question that had lingered in the back of his mind for months now came crashing forward. What now? He had crossed every line, indulged every impulse. But standing on the other side, he felt nothing. The power, the control he thought he had gained had vanished. The jealousy, the anger, they were gone too, replaced by a strange, suffocating numbness. He found himself pulling away, emotionally, mentally, from both Sarah and Mark. Even during their time together, David's mind would drift, no longer captivated by the sight of them. Instead, he would stare out the window, wondering how he had ended up so detached from his own life. How had he gone from obsession to indifference? One evening, after Mark had left and Sarah had gone to bed, David stayed up, sitting alone in the dark living room, nursing a drink. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. He stared at the blank TV, lost in thought, trying to pinpoint the moment when everything had shifted. He had once felt so in control, watching everything, knowing everything. But now that he had fully embraced it, he realized how powerless he truly was. His marriage, his friendship, his very identity had all twisted into something unrecognizable. And now, he didn't know how to return to the man he once was. He couldn't undo what had been done. There was no going back to the simplicity of not knowing. He had thrown himself into this new reality, and now he was drowning in it. The next morning, as Sarah sat across from him at the breakfast table, sipping her coffee, David looked at her and saw the same woman he had always loved. But something was different. She was still his wife, still the mother of his children, but the intimacy between them had changed in ways that could not be reversed. She smiled at him, the same soft smile she always gave, but it no longer held the same warmth. It was as though they were both pretending, playing the roles of their former lives, even though they both knew those lives were gone. "You're quiet today," Sarah said gently, breaking the silence. David forced a smile, shaking his head. "Just thinking," he replied, his tone distant. He wasn't ready to say what was really on his mind. Not yet. But the realization was there, looming like a dark cloud. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, David finally broke the silence. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his thoughts. She looked at him, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" she asked. David hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't think I can do this anymore," he said quietly. The words hung between them, sinking in slowly. Sarah's expression shifted, her eyes widening with surprise. "Do what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. David sighed, running a hand through his hair, feeling the tension inside him. "This, Mark, everything," he said, his voice low. "I thought it was what I wanted. I thought it would give me something, but now I don't know who I am anymore. I feel like I've lost myself." Sarah's face softened, her eyes filled with a mix of understanding and sadness. "David," she started, but he shook his head gently, cutting her off. "It's not your fault," he said quickly. "I'm the one who pushed for this. I'm the one who wanted to see how far we could go. But now that we've gone there, I don't think I can keep doing it. I need to find myself again. I need to figure out who I am without all of this." Sarah looked down at her hands, silent for a long moment. "I understand," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "I felt it too. The change, the distance." She looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "What do we do now?" David stared at her, feeling the weight of her question pressing down on him. He didn't have an answer. For so long, he had been driven by the thrill of their secret, by the allure of something new. But now, standing on the other side, all he saw was the wreckage it had left behind. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, "but I think we need to take a step back. We need to figure out who we are without Mark, without all of this." Sarah nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks as she reached for his hand. "I don't want to lose you, David," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't want to lose us." David gently squeezed her hand, his heart heavy. "I don't want to lose us either," he whispered. "But we need to find ourselves again. We need to rebuild. Together." As silence settled over them, David knew that this was the beginning of something new. Not a return to their old life, but the start of something different. Something real,